It cannot but seem a paradox to say that the 13th was the greatest of centuries. To most people, the idea will appear at once so preposterous that they may not even care to consider it. A certain number, of course, will have their curiosity piqued by the thought that anyone should evolve so curious a notion. Either of these attitudes of mind will yield at once to a more properly receptive mood if it is recalled that the 13th is the century of the Gothic cathedrals, of the foundation of the university, of the signing of Magna Carta, and of the origin of representative government with something like constitutional guarantees throughout the west of Europe. The cathedrals represent a development in the arts that has probably never been equaled either before or since. The university was a definite creation of these generations that has lived and maintained its usefulness practically in the same form in which it was then cast for the 7 centuries ever since. The foundation stones of modern liberties are to be found in the documents which, for the first time, declare the rights of man during this precious period. A little consideration of the men who, at this period, lived lives of undying influence on mankind will still further attract the attention of those who have not usually grouped these great characters together. Just before the century opened, 3 great rulers died at the height of their influence. They are still and will always be the subject of men's thoughts and of literature. They were Frederick Barbarossa, Saladin, and Richard Coeur de Lion. They formed but a suggestive prelude of what was to come in the following century, when such great monarchs as St. Louis of France, St. Ferdinand of Spain, Alfonso the Wise of Castile, Frederick II of Germany, Edward I, the English Justinian, Rudolph of Habsburg, whose descendants still ruled in Austria, and Robert Bruce occupied the thrones of Europe. Was it by chance or providence that the same century saw the rise of and the beginning of the fall of that great Eastern monarchy which had been created by the genius for conquest of Genghis Khan, the Tartar warrior, who ruled over all the eastern world from beyond what are now the western confines of Russia, Poland, and Hungary, into and including what we now call China? But the thrones of Europe and of Asia did not monopolize the great men of the time. The 13th century claims such wonderful churchmen as St. Francis and St. Dominic, while it has only the influence of St. Hugh of Lincoln, who died just as it began. It can be proud of St. Edmund of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, and Robert Grosseteste, all men whose place in history is due to what they did for their people, and such magnificent women as Queen Blanche of Castile, St. Clare of Assisi, and St. Elizabeth of Hungary. The century opened with one of the greatest of the popes on the throne, Innocent III, and it closed with the most misunderstood of popes, who is, in spite of this, one of the worthiest successors of Peter, Boniface VIII. During the century, there had been such men as Honorius IV, the patron of learning, Gregory IX, to whom canon law owes so much, and John the 21st, who had been famous as a scientist before becoming pope. There are such scholars as St. Thomas of Aquin, Albertus Magnus, Roger Bacon, St. Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, Raymond Lully, Vincent of Beauvais, and Alexander of Hales, and such patrons of learning as Robert of Sorbonne and the founders of nearly 20 universities. There were such artists as Gaudi, Cimabue, and above all Giotto, and such literary men as the authors of the Arthur Legends and the Nibelung, the Meistersingers, the Minnesingers, the Troubadours, and Trouveres, and above all, Dante, who is universally considered now to be one of the greatest literary men of all times, but who is not, as is so often thought and said, a solitary phenomenon in the period, but only the culmination of a great literary movement.